You were given a lawful order. Step away from the individual, now.
My lawful order is to my patient. You are interfering with medical care. I am not stopping.
The call came in at 1:14 p.m., a burst of controlled urgency slicing through the warm afternoon air of the city. For Sarah Jenkins, the familiar tone of the dispatcher was a switch, instantly flipping her mind from the mundane calm of the station to the heightened focus required for the job. The details were sparse, but alarming. Medic 3, respond to Oak Ridge City Park, Central Lawn area, adult female unconscious, difficulty breathing, possible anaphylaxis. At 45, with 2 decades of service stitched into the fabric of her uniform, Sarah had learned to read the spaces between the words. Possible anaphylaxis, on a sunny day in a park full of blooming flowers and picnicking families, meant a race against a closing airway. Her partner, Mark Gallo, a man 10 years her junior, whose boundless energy was tempered by the discipline of 2 tours in the Army, was already behind the wheel. The ambulance engine roared to life, and the siren's sharp cry parted the midday traffic like a scalpel. The G-force pressed Sarah back into her seat, a familiar embrace she had felt thousands of times before. This was her office, this speeding box of life and death. The city blurring past the windows was a landscape of potential tragedies, and she was the one racing toward them. She began her mental checklist, her mind a well-organized library of protocols. Anaphylaxis, the body's ultimate overreaction, a biological civil war where the immune system designed to protect becomes the assassin. The key was epinephrine and speed. Every second of delay was a second the brain was being starved of oxygen, a second the throat was swelling, turning a pathway for air into a sealed tomb. Mark's driving was aggressive but precise, his hands steady on the wheel, his eyes constantly scanning, anticipating the moves of civilian drivers who often panicked at the sound of an approaching siren. They had been partners for 5 years, a seamless unit that communicated more through glances and gestures than words. Sarah pulled a fresh pair of nitrile gloves from the dispenser, the snap against her wrists a familiar ritual that sharpened her focus. She was born and raised in this city, a daughter of a teacher and a mechanic. She had seen it all, the horrific carnage of multi-car pileups, the quiet tragedy of a life ending in a sterile nursing home, the joy of delivering a baby in the back of this very truck. She had earned the respect of her peers not through bravado, but through an unshakable competence and a deep well of compassion that she guarded fiercely. In a profession that could easily breed cynicism, Sarah held on to the belief that every life was worth the fight. They arrived at the park in under 6 minutes. A small crowd had formed a tight circle on the vast green lawn, a human beacon marking the emergency. Mark expertly navigated the ambulance along a paved service path, bringing them to a stop just yards away. The scene was exactly as she'd pictured: a scattered picnic blanket, an overturned basket, and in the center, a young woman lying motionless on the grass. Sarah was out of the ambulance before Mark had even killed the engine. She grabbed the jump bag, a 50-pound pack containing the essential tools of advanced life support, and slung it over her shoulder. "Mark, get the stretcher and the airway kit," she called out, her voice cutting through the murmurs of the onlookers. Her eyes were already locked on her patient. The crowd parted for her, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and genuine relief. She dropped to her knees beside the woman. She was young, early 20s, dressed in a light summer dress. Her face was terrifyingly swollen, her lips tinged with a bluish hue, cyanosis, the telltale sign of oxygen deprivation. A man knelt beside her, his face pale with panic. "She was just eating a sandwich," he stammered, his voice trembling. "There were walnuts in it. She's allergic. Her EpiPen, it's expired. It didn't work." Sarah's gloved fingers went straight to the woman's neck, searching for a carotid pulse. It was there, but it was thready and terrifyingly fast, tachycardia. Her breathing was a series of high-pitched, strained squeaks, stridor, the sound of air trying to force its way through a rapidly closing gap. "She's closing up," Sarah announced, her voice calm but projecting an authority that commanded the scene. She reached into her jump bag, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. The clock was ticking. She had maybe a minute, 2 at most, before that tiny opening in the woman's throat swelled completely shut. The golden hour of trauma was a luxury. This was the golden minute, and it was slipping away. "Mark, I need that airway kit now!" Sarah's voice was sharp, a command that underscored the gravity of the situation. Her patient's gasps were becoming weaker, shallower. The fight was leaving her. Sarah ripped open a packet containing a syringe and a small vial. Epinephrine, the silver bullet for anaphylaxis. She drew up the correct dose, her movements fluid and certain, a dance of practiced muscle memory. She swabbed the woman's thigh and plunged the needle deep into the muscle. Now, they could only hope it would work fast enough to reverse the catastrophic swelling. Mark arrived, skidding to a halt on the grass beside her, the red airway bag and the cardiac monitor in his hands. He didn't need to be told what to do. He immediately began preparing the intubation equipment, laryngoscope, endotracheal tube, suction. If the epinephrine didn't work, their only option was to force a breathing tube down the patient's throat, a difficult procedure made nearly impossible when the anatomy was this swollen and distorted. "Come on, sweetheart, stay with me," Sarah whispered to the unconscious woman, placing a bag valve mask over her face and beginning to squeeze, trying to force oxygen into her struggling lungs. The bag was stiff, resisting her efforts. It was like trying to inflate a balloon with a knot tied in it. A few onlookers were filming with their phones, a grim reality of the modern world she had learned to ignore. Her entire universe had shrunk to the woman on the grass, the feel of the resisting breathing bag, and the frantic hope that the medication would kick in. It was then that a new figure appeared at the edge of her vision. A police officer, walking with a measured, deliberate stride that felt jarringly out of place amidst the controlled chaos of the medical emergency. He was young, maybe 30, with a strong jaw and mirrored sunglasses that made him impossible to read. His uniform was crisp, his posture rigid, and his hand rested casually on the grip of his holstered sidearm. He stopped a few feet away, his shadow falling over Sarah and her patient. "What's the situation here?" the officer asked. His voice was flat, authoritative, laced with an impatience that set Sarah's teeth on edge. The panicked young man who had been with the patient answered, "It's my girlfriend, Chloe. She's having an allergic reaction. They're helping her." The officer's gaze swept over the scene, taking in the scattered picnic, the small crowd, and the paramedics working on the ground. He seemed less concerned with the medical crisis and more concerned with the untidiness of it all. "All right, I need everyone to back up," he said, his voice rising in volume. "Clear the area. This is a potential crime scene." Sarah's head snapped up. "Crime scene?" she repeated, her focus momentarily broken. "Officer, this is a medical emergency, a severe anaphylactic reaction." The officer, whose nameplate read Cade Bryant, took another step closer, planting his feet in a wide, commanding stance. "The woman collapsed. I need to secure the scene to determine the cause. That means everything stops until I say so. You need to step away from the individual." The order was so completely divorced from the reality of the situation that for a moment, Sarah could only stare at him. Step away. The woman's heart was racing, her body starved of oxygen. Stepping away for even 30 seconds could be a death sentence. "Officer, with all due respect, I am a paramedic actively treating a critical patient," she said, her tone deliberately even and professional. She had to de-escalate. Her patient's life depended on it. "Her airway is closing. I cannot and will not step away from her." A flicker of annoyance crossed Officer Bryant's face. It was clear this was not the response he expected. He was used to his orders being followed without question. He saw a chaotic scene he needed to control, and in his mind, Sarah was now just another variable, an obstacle to that control. A line had just been drawn on the soft green grass of the park, a line between a paramedic's duty to save a life and a police officer's desire to exert absolute authority. "Ma'am, I'm not going to say it again," Officer Bryant said, his voice losing its flat tone and gaining a sharp, condescending edge. "This is my scene now. You will stop what you are doing and you will back away. Sarah ignored him, turning her full attention back to her patient, Chloe. The epinephrine was starting to have an effect, but it was slow. The stridor in Chloe's breathing was marginally better, but her oxygen saturation levels, displayed on the portable pulse oximeter Mark had attached to her finger, were still dangerously low. "Mark, let's get a line in. Large bore IV, normal saline, wide open," she instructed, her voice a calm, steady counterpoint to the officer's abrasive commands. She was effectively dismissing him, communicating through her actions that her patient was the only authority she answered to in this moment. This blatant disregard for his command seemed to infuriate Officer Bryant. He took another step forward, his polished black boots now just inches from the medical equipment laid out on the grass. "Did you not hear me? I gave you a lawful order, paramedic. And I am performing my lawful duty as a licensed medical professional to provide life-saving care," Sarah retorted, her eyes still locked on Chloe's face. She didn't raise her voice. She kept it clinical, professional, a tactic she'd learned over years of dealing with agitated family members and volatile patients. Anger only fed anger. Professionalism was a shield. "State law protects my right and responsibility to treat a patient in critical condition. Interfering with that treatment is a felony. Now, you can either help us by keeping the crowd back, or you can step aside and let us do our jobs." The silence that followed was thick with tension. Mark froze for a second, IV catheter in hand, his eyes wide as he looked from Sarah to the rigid, intimidating figure of the police officer. The small crowd of onlookers grew quiet, their phones still held high, now recording not just a medical emergency, but a brewing confrontation. The only sounds were the soft beep of the pulse oximeter and the distant hum of city traffic. "I need to see your identification," Bryant demanded, shifting his strategy. If he couldn't intimidate her into compliance, he would bog her down in procedure, asserting his authority through bureaucracy. "My identification is in the ambulance," Sarah said without looking up. "My partner can retrieve my credentials for you, or you can verify them through your dispatcher. But I am not stopping treatment of a dying woman to find my wallet." "So you're refusing to identify yourself?" he pressed, twisting her words. "I'm refusing to abandon my patient," Sarah corrected him sharply. "There's a critical difference. Mark, is that line in?" "In and running," Mark confirmed, his own voice tight with stress. He'd successfully threaded the IV into a vein in Chloe's arm. "Good. Let's push another dose of epi. IV this time," Sarah ordered. They were a team, a well-oiled machine, and Bryant was a wrench thrown into the gears. Every second he distracted them, every moment they had to engage with his absurd demands, was a second stolen from Chloe. The patient's swollen face was a constant, terrifying reminder of what was at stake. Sarah could feel Officer Bryant's stare burning into the side of her head. This was no longer about securing a scene. This was a battle of wills, a dangerous power struggle happening over the body of a woman who was fighting for every breath. His ego had become a direct threat to her patient's life, and Sarah would not let it win. She would not be intimidated. She would not be deterred. She would save this woman's life, and he could write whatever ticket he wanted to afterwards. She simply did not care. "Let's get her on the stretcher. We need to move. Now," Sarah said to Mark, her decision made. The hospital was their best chance. They needed the controlled environment and the advanced equipment of an emergency room. The field was no longer safe, not with Officer Bryant's unpredictable presence looming over them. She and Mark moved in unison, positioning their hands under Chloe's back and legs to execute a coordinated lift onto the stretcher that Mark had positioned beside them. It was a critical, delicate maneuver, but as they tensed their muscles to lift, Officer Bryant made his move. He didn't just speak, he acted. He stepped directly into the path between Sarah and the stretcher, physically blocking her. His body was a wall, an obstruction made of blue surge and belligerence. "You are not going anywhere," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You are obstructing my investigation." Sarah's patience, a deep and usually unshakable reservoir, finally ran dry. Her anger, when it came, was not hot and explosive, but cold and sharp. "You are obstructing emergency medical care," she shot back, her eyes meeting his mirrored sunglasses. "This woman is my only priority. Now get out of my way." For a heart-stopping moment, they were locked in a stalemate. The paramedic on her knees, hands ready to save a life, the police officer on his feet, arms crossed, a symbol of the law transformed into an obstacle to survival. The crowd murmured, their disbelief turning to anger. "Hey, leave her alone!" one man shouted. "She's trying to help!" Bryant's head snapped toward the voice. "You stay out of this or you're next!" he yelled, pointing a finger at the man. It was a fatal miscalculation. His attention was diverted for only a second, but it was the opening Sarah needed. She wasn't going to wait for his permission. "Mark, on 3, she began. 1, 2. She never made it to 3. As she shifted her weight, Bryant's hand clamped down on her upper arm. His grip was like a vice, a sudden, shocking violation that sent a jolt through her. "I told you to stop," he growled, his face now inches from hers, the acrid smell of his cheap coffee on his breath. "You don't decide what happens here, I do." The world seemed to warp and slow down. The feel of his fingers digging into her bicep, the sight of Chloe's cyanotic lips, the sound of Mark's sharp, incredulous gasp. This was it. A line had not just been crossed, it had been obliterated. This was no longer a jurisdictional dispute. This was a physical assault, an assault on her profession, and on her patient's chance of survival. She looked from the white-knuckled grip on her arm up to his sunglasses, which reflected a distorted fish-eye image of her own face, a mask of cold, controlled fury. "Take your hand off me, officer," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "You're under arrest," Bryant declared, the words booming with a sense of triumphant finality. He seemed to relish them, the ultimate expression of his power. The statement was so preposterous, so completely unmoored from the reality of the situation that Sarah could only stare at him for a beat. Arrested? For what? For refusing to let a woman suffocate? "Arrested for what?" she demanded, yanking her arm from his grasp with a sharp twist. She immediately turned back to Chloe, placing her hands back in position to lift. "Mark, we are leaving, now!" She was done talking, but as she and Mark tensed again, Bryant acted with shocking violence. He grabbed her by the shoulder of her uniform and yanked her backward. She stumbled, losing her balance. The airway kit beside her tipped over, its precious sterile contents, breathing tubes, laryngoscope blades, forceps, spilling across the dirty grass. "You're under arrest for obstruction of justice and resisting a law enforcement officer," Bryant shouted, his voice ringing with victory. He spun her around with surprising force, wrenching her arms behind her back. The cold, unforgiving steel of handcuffs closed around her wrists. The sharp click, click, click of the ratchet tightening was the loudest sound she had ever heard. It was the sound of a world turned upside down, where a hero was treated like a felon. The bite of the metal into her skin was a sharp, grounding pain in the midst of the surreal chaos. "My patient!" The cry was torn from Sarah's throat, her professional composure finally shattering. A raw, desperate plea replaced the calm command. Twisting against the unyielding steel of the cuffs, she craned her head back towards the scene. "Mark, don't stop! You have to get her to the hospital! Go!" Her plea snapped Mark out of his stunned paralysis. Shaking with a mixture of adrenaline and rage, he immediately dropped back to Chloe's side. His hands, though trembling, moved with purpose, checking her vitals, adjusting her oxygen. He was alone now, a single paramedic trying to do the work of two, his partner being dragged away in handcuffs. The scene erupted into chaos. The crowd of onlookers, once passive witnesses, became an angry mob. They surged forward, a wall of outrage, their phones held high, recording every second. "What the hell are you doing? She was saving her! You're a monster!" The shouts rained down on Officer Bryant, who seemed momentarily taken aback by the crowd's fury. But his jaw hardened, his resolve solidifying in the face of their condemnation. He shoved Sarah toward his patrol car, his hand planted firmly in the middle of her back. "Get back, all of you!" he roared at the crowd. "Disperse now or you'll all be arrested for interference." As he forced her away, Sarah's eyes remained locked on Chloe, a young woman whose life had been in her hands just moments before. She saw Mark working desperately, a lone responder in a sea of chaos. She saw Chloe's color worsening, a deeper, more terrifying shade of blue. She knew with a sickening certainty that this delay, this insane, pointless, ego-driven delay, was costing Chloe precious brain cells, precious time, precious life. The door of the patrol car stood open, the black vinyl interior radiating heat. Bryant pushed her unceremoniously into the back seat. The door slammed shut with a deafening thud, the sound of a cage being sealed. Through the reinforced glass and the metal grate, she watched the scene play out like a silent, horrifying film. She saw Mark on his radio, his mouth moving frantically, calling for another unit, for a supervisor, for anyone who could fix this nightmare. She saw the bystanders creating a protective circle around him and the patient, their bodies a defiant barrier against the officer who had so profoundly betrayed his oath. She was a paramedic, cuffed in the back of a police car, watching a patient die. And the man who had put her there was supposed to be her ally. He hadn't just arrested her, he had abandoned his most fundamental duty. In that moment, sitting in the suffocating heat of the car, a cold, clear resolution formed in the pit of her stomach. This would not stand. Officer Cade Bryant had just made the biggest mistake of his career. He just didn't know it yet. The drive to the central booking facility was a journey through a surreal landscape. The city she served, the streets she knew like the back of her hand, looked alien through the grated window. Bryant drove in silence, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. He was crafting his narrative, twisting her life-saving actions into a story of insubordination. The booking facility was a place Sarah had been to dozens of times, but always through the ambulance bay, dropping off patients who needed medical clearance before being jailed. She had always been on the other side of the divide, a respected professional. Now she was led through the sally port in handcuffs, the heavy steel doors clanging shut behind her, echoing the finality of her situation. Bryant gripped her arm, steering her through corridors that smelled of disinfectant and despair. He pushed her toward the booking desk, presided over by a world-weary sergeant, a woman in her late 50s with sharp eyes and a nameplate that read, Rostova. "Got one for you, Ava," Bryant announced, his voice unnecessarily loud. "Obstruction and resisting." Sergeant Rostova looked up, her gaze falling on Sarah's uniform, then the handcuffs, then Bryant's smug face. A skeptical eyebrow arched on her forehead. "You arrested a paramedic? On a call?" she asked, her tone dripping with disbelief. "What in God's name for, Cade? Did she try to heal someone too aggressively?" Officer Bryant's face flushed a deep, angry red at the sergeant's open sarcasm. "She refused to follow a lawful order at a scene I was securing, Sergeant," he said, puffing out his chest. "She became belligerent and interfered with my investigation." "Investigation into what exactly?" Sergeant Rostova pressed, leaning forward on her elbows, her eyes narrowing. She had been on the job for 30 years and could smell a bad arrest from a mile away. "I heard the radio traffic. It was a medical call, a kid with an allergic reaction. What were you investigating? A case of homicidal walnuts?" The biting humor earned a few stifled chuckles from other officers within earshot. "I was treating a critical patient, Sergeant," Sarah interjected, her voice steady and clear despite the humiliation of her position. "I informed the officer I would provide my credentials as soon as my patient was stabilized for transport. Her life was the immediate priority." Rostova's experienced gaze shifted from Bryant's defensive posture to Sarah's resolute face. She saw no belligerence there, only the exhaustion and quiet fury of a professional who had been prevented from doing her job. "You pulled a medic off a critical patient because she didn't show you her driver's license fast enough?" Rostova asked Bryant, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous level. "Is that the official story you want me to put in this report?" "I was securing the scene," Bryant insisted, but his voice had lost its bluster. He was a junior officer facing down a veteran sergeant who clearly wasn't buying his flimsy justification. Rostova just shook her head slowly, a look of profound disappointment on her face. She turned to the booking officer. "Process her, be quick about it, and get her union rep on the phone, now." She shot a final, withering glare at Bryant. "My office. We need to have a long talk about your definition of securing a scene." The booking process was a systematic stripping away of dignity. Sarah's fingerprints were taken, the ink a black stain on the hands she used to save lives. A mugshot was taken, the harsh flash capturing her exhausted but defiant expression. She was instructed to remove her personal belongings, her wallet, her phone, her watch, her wedding ring. The irony was suffocating. The very identification Bryant had deemed more important than a woman's life was now being cataloged as evidence of her supposed crime. An hour later, after being processed and placed in a cold, concrete holding cell, the heavy door clanged open. A man in a sharply tailored dark suit stood there. He was tall, in his early 50s, with a commanding presence and intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing. "Sarah Jenkins?" he asked, his voice a deep, reassuring baritone. "My name is Marcus Thorne. I'm the attorney for the Paramedics Union. Your supervisor called me. I've already spoken with Sergeant Rostova. Let's get you out of this place." A wave of relief so profound it almost buckled Sarah's knees washed over her. She wasn't alone anymore. The system she had dedicated her life to was now fighting for her. As Thorne led her through the paperwork for her release, his expression was grim. "I've reviewed Officer Bryant's preliminary report," he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "It's a work of fiction. He's claiming you were hysterical and physically pushed him. He's doubling down, trying to protect himself." They walked out of the station and into the bright, unforgiving sunlight. Sarah blinked, feeling as though she was surfacing after being held underwater. She was free, but the injustice felt like a physical weight on her shoulders. "This isn't just about a wrongful arrest, is it?" she asked, already knowing the answer. Marcus Thorne stopped and turned to face her, his expression serious. "No, Sarah, it's not. Officer Bryant didn't just arrest a paramedic. He may have handed a young woman a death sentence for the sake of his own ego. He didn't just violate your rights, he violated his oath to protect and serve. And we are going to make him, and the city that trained him, accountable for every single second of it. This isn't just a lawsuit anymore. This is a war, and you are on the front line. But you won't be fighting it alone." His vow hung in the air, a promise of the righteous battle to come. Mark Gallo was waiting in the parking lot, leaning against the side of the ambulance which he'd already retrieved from where it had been left at the park. His uniform was rumpled, and his face was a mask of exhaustion and fury. He rushed forward as soon as he saw Sarah, pulling her into a fierce, protective hug. "Sarah, my God, are you okay?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "I've been better," she managed, pulling back. The question that had been clawing at her insides finally burst out. "Chloe, the patient! Tell me about Chloe!" Mark's face clouded over, the anger replaced by a deep, sorrowful pain. He took a deep breath. "It's bad, Sarah. Really bad. Another unit got there about 8 minutes after they took you. They had to do a cricothyrotomy right there on the grass." He was referring to a surgical airway, a last-ditch incision into the throat to bypass the swollen larynx. "She'd been without a patent airway for too long." The words landed like punches. Every paramedic dreads a crick. It's a procedure of desperation, one that means everything else has failed. "I followed them to the hospital," Mark continued, his voice cracking. "I stayed until her parents got there. The ER doctor, he said the prolonged hypoxia, the lack of oxygen, it caused a severe anoxic brain injury. They got her heart back into a stable rhythm, but she hasn't woken up. They don't know if she ever will. And if she does, they don't know how much of her will be there." Sarah felt the ground shift beneath her feet. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. This wasn't a close call. This wasn't a patient lost to an unavoidable injury or illness. This was a life, a vibrant young woman with a future, potentially erased because of one man's fragile ego. Those precious minutes, the ones Officer Bryant had stolen while he postured and demanded and finally arrested her, those were the minutes Chloe's brain was dying. The image of Bryant's smug, triumphant face as he tightened the cuffs flashed in her mind, and her simmering rage ignited into a white-hot, silent inferno. "Her family?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Devastated. They don't understand. The boyfriend told them everything. The construction crew." "Wait, wrong story." Mark corrected himself, referencing a story he'd heard about another case. "The bystanders, the ones who were filming. They stayed and talked to the other medics, to the supervisor. They know exactly what happened." Marcus Thorne, who had been standing back to give them a moment, stepped forward. His expression was granite. "This confirms our path," he said, his voice cold and hard. "The harm is no longer theoretical. We have a direct, documented, and catastrophic consequence of Officer Bryant's actions. We're no longer just talking about your civil rights being violated, Sarah. We're talking about a young woman whose life has been irrevocably shattered because a police officer couldn't handle being told that her life was more important than his authority." They drove to Thorne's office, a sleek, modern space in a downtown skyscraper that felt like a different universe from the grit and despair of the holding cell. For the next 4 hours, Sarah gave a formal, recorded statement. Thorne's team was already a whirlwind of motion, filing motions, identifying and contacting witnesses from the videos that were already beginning to surface online, and drafting the initial complaint. A paralegal brought in sworn affidavits from 3 different people who had been at the park, their cell phone videos attached as digital evidence. Though shaky, the footage was damning. It clearly showed Sarah providing medical care. It captured Bryant's aggressive posture and his escalating demands. And it recorded with horrifying clarity the moment he physically pulled her off her patient and cuffed her. The sound of the airway kits scattering on the grass was sickeningly audible. This wasn't just her word against his anymore. This was his own arrogant performance, captured for the world to see. The lawsuit was filed electronically at 8 a.m. the next morning. It was an explosive document, detailing in cold, precise legal language the horrifying events of the previous day. It named Officer Cade Bryant and the city of Oak Ridge as defendants, seeking unspecified damages for the violation of Sarah's civil rights, false arrest, battery, and the intentional interference with emergency medical care that had led to catastrophic patient harm. By 9 a.m., the media storm had begun. The story was tailor-made for the 24-hour news cycle and the ravenous appetite of social media. The narrative was irresistible. A heroic veteran black paramedic arrested by a young, white, overzealous cop while saving a woman's life. The witness videos, which had been sent to a local news blogger, went viral almost instantly. The most widely shared clip, a 45-second video shot by a college student, was particularly damning. It began just as Bryant was shouting, "You are obstructing my investigation!" It captured Sarah's cold, clear reply, "You are obstructing emergency medical care." It showed him physically blocking her, then the violent arrest, the spilled medical kit, and Sarah's desperate cry for her patient as she was led away. By lunchtime, the hashtag Justice for Sarah Jenkins was trending nationally. The image of Sarah, a respected 20-year veteran of the city's fire department, being forced into the back of a patrol car while her patient lay dying on the grass, was broadcast on every major news network. Her phone, which she'd gotten back with her other belongings, began to light up with an endless stream of calls and texts from friends, family, and colleagues from across the country, all expressing their shock, outrage, and unwavering support. The Oak Ridge Fire Department, after consulting with the union, issued a powerful statement standing firmly behind Sarah. It called her one of the department's most decorated and respected paramedics, and stated that her actions were heroic and in accordance with the highest standards of patient care and state protocols. It was a clear shot across the bow of the police department. The police department, in stark contrast, issued a terse, defensive statement that only added fuel to the fire. It said the incident was under internal investigation, and that Officer Bryant had been placed on administrative desk duty pending the outcome of the review. It was a classic, bureaucratic non-response that the public immediately saw as an attempt to protect one of their own. The battle lines were drawn. On one side stood Sarah, with the full backing of her union, her department, and a formidable Marcus Thorne. On the other stood Officer Cade Bryant, and a city bureaucracy that would now go to extraordinary lengths to defend itself and its employee from the consequences of his actions. The lawsuit wasn't just a legal filing, it was a declaration of war. A war Sarah had never asked for, but one she was now fully committed to winning, not just for herself, but for Chloe Davis, the young woman lying silent in a hospital bed, a victim of an injustice far greater than a wrongful arrest. For Sarah, life became surreal. She was on paid leave from the job she loved, spending her days in meetings with lawyers instead of responding to 911 calls. She tried to maintain a low profile, but her face was everywhere. Strangers would stop her at the grocery store to shake her hand, to thank her for her service and for standing up. The attention was deeply uncomfortable, but it solidified her resolve. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore, she was fighting for all of them, for every person who had ever been silenced by a uniform. In the world of high-stakes municipal litigation, the first move from a defendant like a city is often a test of will, a probe to see if the plaintiff can be bought off cheaply and quietly. 2 weeks after the lawsuit was filed, Marcus Thorne received the call he had been expecting from the city attorney's office. "They want to settle," he told Sarah over the phone, his voice flat and devoid of surprise. "They're trying to see how serious we are, hoping this media storm will die down and they can make it all go away." "What's the offer?" Sarah asked, a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. She knew it wouldn't be substantial, but she was unprepared for the sheer audacity of it. Marcus let out a short, humorless laugh. "You should probably sit down. They're offering to expunge the arrest from your record, pay your legal fees up to this point, and give you $50,000 for your inconvenience." He let the words hang in the air. $50,000. It wasn't a settlement. It was a profound insult. It was the monetary equivalent of a pat on the head and a run along now. It was a nuisance value offer, a sum meant to make a PR problem disappear before it became too expensive or politically embarrassing. It was an offer made by people who saw this not as a gross violation of rights that led to a life-altering tragedy, but as a temporary public relations headache to be managed. Sarah was silent for a long moment, the number echoing in her mind. $50,000 for her humiliation, for her reputation, for the trauma of being assaulted and caged. $50,000 for what had happened to Chloe Davis. The offer was more infuriating than if they had offered nothing at all. "Tell them to go to hell," she said, her voice laced with ice. "Tell them I will see them in court." "That's the answer I was hoping for," Marcus replied, a note of pride in his voice. "I already told them their offer was offensive, and that our next conversation would be during depositions. This was their first move. They were hoping you were just looking for a quick payday, that the pressure and the publicity would make you want to fold. They have fundamentally misjudged you, Sarah." They had. The city's lawyers and risk managers had made a critical error. They had mistaken Sarah's quiet, dignified professionalism for weakness. They didn't understand that her fight was no longer just about her own vindication. It had become a crusade for Chloe. The latest update on Chloe's condition was devastating. She had emerged from her coma, but as the doctors feared, the anoxic brain injury was severe and permanent. She could breathe on her own, but she couldn't speak. She could follow movement with her eyes, but she couldn't move her limbs. She was trapped inside her own body, a prisoner of a few minutes of interrupted medical care. She would require round-the-clock care for the rest of her life. She was 22 years old. Her family had retained their own lawyer and were preparing a separate multi-million-dollar lawsuit against the city. The two cases, while legally distinct, were inextricably linked. Every victory for Sarah would be a victory for Chloe. When news of the city's nuisance value settlement offer leaked to the press, a strategic and anonymous leak from Thorne's office, the story exploded with renewed fury. Editorials were written condemning the city's callous and insulting behavior. National news outlets picked up the story, framing it as a textbook example of police overreach compounded by municipal arrogance. A GoFundMe page started by Sarah's fire station to support Chloe Davis's family was flooded with donations, raising hundreds of thousands of dollars from strangers across the country. The pressure on the city became immense. The police chief was hammered with questions at a press conference about Officer Bryant's disciplinary record. It was revealed that in his short 4-year career, Bryant had accumulated nearly a dozen citizen complaints for excessive force and abuse of authority, none of which had resulted in any significant disciplinary action. He was a lawsuit waiting to happen, a problem the department had chosen to ignore until he finally detonated on a national stage. The city's attempt to quietly resolve the issue had backfired spectacularly, turning a local crisis into a national symbol of a broken system. With settlement talks having crashed and burned in spectacular fashion, the lawsuit moved into the discovery phase. This was the methodical, often tedious heart of litigation, a battle fought not in a courtroom, but through a relentless exchange of documents, data, and demands. For months, Marcus Thorne's office was inundated with thousands of pages from the city, training manuals thicker than phone books, internal affairs reports, dense policy guidelines, and Officer Cade Bryant's complete, unredacted personnel file. Thorne and his team of young, hungry associates sifted through the mountain of paper, searching for the patterns, the overlooked memo, the buried complaint that would strengthen their case. They found what they were looking for in Bryant's file, a clear history of escalating aggression, of contempt of cop complaints, where citizens were cited or arrested for questioning his authority. He was a bully with a badge, and the department's failure to rein him in was a clear pattern of negligence. But all of it, the training manuals, the personnel files, the previous complaints, was secondary. It was all context, supporting evidence for the one item they had been waiting for, the single piece of evidence that would be the centerpiece of their entire case. It arrived on a password-protected hard drive delivered by a court courier, an object that felt heavier than its physical weight. It was the unedited, hour-long footage from Officer Cade Bryant's body camera. Thorne had it set up in a conference room on a large 80-inch monitor. The room's blinds were drawn, creating a somber, theater-like atmosphere. Sarah sat beside him, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap her knuckles were white. Mark Gallo was there too, for support and to corroborate the sequence of events from his perspective. "Are you ready for this?" Thorne asked her gently. "It won't be easy to watch." Sarah took a deep, steadying breath and gave a firm nod. "Play it." The video began with a jarring, unsteady view of the dashboard of Bryant's patrol car. The audio was crystal clear, the dispatcher's voice on the radio, the low rumble of the engine. Then came the sound of the car door opening and the crunch of his boots on the park's gravel path as he got out. He began walking toward the scene, the camera's perspective becoming his own, an unnerving first-person view of the confrontation he was about to create. He approached the circle of onlookers, his voice already sharp, imbued with an authority he clearly felt was absolute. "What's going on here? Everybody back up, give me some room." Then the camera centered on her. It was a strange, out-of-body experience for Sarah, seeing herself from his viewpoint. A woman kneeling on the ground, her back mostly to him, completely engrossed in her patient. The footage was visceral, immediate, and far more damning than even the bystander videos had been. The camera's high-definition lens captured the terrifying, waxy pallor of Chloe Davis's skin, the subtle but desperate flutter of her eyelids. It was obvious to anyone, medically trained or not, that the woman on the ground was dying. and the audio was a symphony of his arrogance. "Step away from her," his voice commanded from the camera's microphone, cold and devoid of any empathy or inquiry. "I'm a paramedic," her own voice replied from off-screen, calm and focused. "This is a severe anaphylactic reaction." The footage perfectly corroborated her story and eviscerated his. The camera, and by extension Bryant himself, showed absolutely no interest in the patient's condition. It remained fixed on Sarah, the perceived source of defiance, the nail that needed to be hammered down. The lens didn't once pan to Chloe's face or to Mark's frantic work. It just stared at her. The unblinking eye of the camera was the infallible witness, a perfect recording of his priorities. And in that critical moment, his priority was not the dying woman on the grass. It was the paramedic who had dared to tell him no. As the video continued to play in the darkened conference room, the atmosphere grew heavy with a mixture of vindication and nausea. They were watching the incident unfold through the aggressor's eyes, a chilling and undeniable perspective. The camera recorded Sarah's repeated calm attempts to explain the medical urgency. "Officer, her airway is closing. I cannot step away. Every second is critical." Her voice was a textbook example of professional crisis management. In response, the audio captured Bryant's escalating impatience. "I said step away, now! I need to see your ID." His words weren't those of an officer trying to understand a situation. They were the demands of a man whose authority had been challenged and who could not tolerate it. The camera lurched as he stepped forward to block Sarah from the stretcher. His own voice, captured by the microphone inches from his mouth, was a low growl. "You are obstructing my investigation." Her reply, "You are obstructing emergency medical care," was just as clear, a stark statement of fact that the video made undeniably true. Then came the most crucial moments. The camera swung wildly as Bryant grabbed Sarah's arm. The footage became a chaotic jumble of her back, the green grass, and the blue sky as he spun her around and violently forced her arms behind her back. The sharp metallic clicks of the handcuffs being ratcheted tight were picked up with perfect, sickening clarity by the microphone. The video didn't lie. It didn't have a narrative. It just showed. And what it showed was an assault. The footage continued for another 20 minutes. It captured the angry shouts of the bystanders. It showed Mark, his face a mask of desperation, working alone on Chloe. It showed the arrival of the second ambulance, the frantic transfer of care. And it showed the long, silent walk back to the patrol car, where the camera recorded Bryant placing Sarah in the back seat as if she were a piece of cargo, his breathing heavy, but his demeanor unchanged. He had won. He had gotten his compliance. When the video finally ended and the monitor went black, the conference room was utterly silent for a full minute. Mark was slowly shaking his head, his face pale. Sarah felt strangely numb. It was all there. Every lie in Bryant's report, every self-serving statement the city had made in its defense was obliterated by this single, unblinking recording of the truth. Marcus Thorne sat back in his chair, a slow, grim smile spreading across his face. He looked at Sarah, his eyes filled with a lawyer's awe. "In 30 years of practicing law," he said, his voice quiet, "I have never seen a more powerful or self-incriminating piece of evidence. That camera didn't just record an unlawful arrest. It recorded a man's character. It recorded his arrogance, his insecurity, and his utter and complete disregard for human life." He stood up and began to pace the room, energized, the hunter who had just cornered his prey. "This changes everything," he said, his voice rising with excitement. "Their entire strategy was to paint you as the aggressor, as uncooperative, as hysterical. This video proves you were the only person in that entire interaction who remained calm, professional, and focused on the only thing that mattered. Bryant wasn't a cop maintaining order. He was a bully who couldn't handle a woman telling him she had a more important job to do than stroke his ego." Thorne stopped pacing and looked at the blank screen. "The city's lawyers will see this footage, and they will know their case is unwinnable. They will come back to the table with a real settlement offer, a much bigger one." He turned to Sarah, his eyes glinting with righteous fire. But that's not what we're going to do. We are not going to let them bury this video with a non-disclosure agreement. We're going to show this video to a jury. We're going to let 12 ordinary citizens see exactly what Officer Cade Bryant did in that park. We're going to make him watch it, and we're going to make him explain every single second of it under oath. This case is no longer about getting you a settlement, Sarah. It's about getting you justice, the kind of justice that changes laws and ends careers. A deposition is not a trial. There is no judge robed in black, no jury of one's peers. It takes place in the sterile beige confines of a law firm's largest conference room. But in many ways, it is a more grueling and naked form of combat. It is a slow, methodical dissection of a witness's story, a battle of attrition designed to lock them into a version of events they cannot later change, and to expose every weakness, every contradiction, every lie for the trial to come. Officer Cade Bryant walked into the deposition room flanked by two stone-faced attorneys from the city. He wore a crisp, dark suit, not his uniform, but he carried himself with the same ramrod-straight posture, the same air of unshakable confidence he'd had in the park. He was there to defend his actions, to project the image of a decisive officer who had been forced to take control of a chaotic scene from an uncooperative, hysterical paramedic. He believed his version of the story, polished and sanitized for the official report, would protect him. He was profoundly, catastrophically wrong. For the first hour, one of the city's attorneys led Bryant through his own testimony, allowing him to construct his narrative. He described arriving at a disorderly scene, his attempts to secure the area for the safety of all personnel, and Paramedic Jenkins's immediate and hostile refusal to comply with lawful orders. He painted a picture of himself as the calm center of a storm, a professional doing his job under difficult circumstances. Then, it was Marcus Thorne's turn. Thorne began calmly, his voice gentle, his questions simple and direct. Officer Bryant, you've been with the Oak Ridge Police Department for 4 years, is that correct? Yes, sir. And in that time, have you received training on interacting with other first responders at emergency scenes? Yes, sir. We receive extensive training. And does that training instruct you that the immediate life-saving care of a patient is the top priority at a medical emergency? Bryant shifted in his seat, a flicker of unease in his eyes. My priority is to secure the scene. That wasn't my question, officer, Thorne said, his voice still mild. Does your training instruct you that a paramedic's active treatment of a critical patient takes precedence over administrative requests, like asking for identification? The city's attorney objected, asked and answered, but Thorne just smiled. Let me rephrase. At any point did you believe the patient, Ms. Davis, was not in serious medical distress? I am not a medical professional, Bryant said stiffly. I could not make that assessment. Exactly, Thorne pounced, his voice sharpening slightly. You are not a medical professional, yet you felt qualified to order the actual medical professional on scene to stop providing care. Is that correct? I ordered her to step back so I could secure the scene. Thorne nodded slowly, then turned to his paralegal. Please play the first video exhibit, body camera footage of Officer Bryant, timestamp 13/16/24. The large monitor at the end of the conference table flickered to life. The deposition room was filled with the sounds of the park as the video began. Thorne had Bryant watch the first 2 minutes, his arrival, his initial aggressive demands. Officer, Thorne said, pausing the video just after Bryant had yelled, I said step away now. At this point, you had been on scene for less than 45 seconds. You had not spoken to any credible witnesses. You had not assessed any potential threats. Yet you decided the most important action was to stop the paramedic from treating her patient. Why? I was establishing control of the scene, Bryant repeated, the words sounding hollow now, a mantra he clung to. Control over what exactly? A woman on her knees trying to save another woman's life? Thorne let the question hang in the air before playing the next segment, the one where Sarah calmly explained the patient's condition. He paused it again. Officer, On this video, we hear Paramedic Jenkins, a 20-year veteran, telling you the patient's airway is closing. You understood that to be a life-threatening condition, correct? I understood it was a medical situation, Bryant equivocated. And yet your response was not to ask how you could help. Your response was to demand her identification. Is that standard procedure, to arrest a paramedic for prioritizing her dying patient over your request for her driver's license? Thorne's voice was rising now, losing its gentle tone and taking on a hard, prosecutorial edge. For the next 4 hours, he dismantled Bryant's story, piece by piece, using the officer's own camera footage as the wrecking ball. He forced Bryant to watch himself yank Sarah away from the patient. "Please describe for the record what is happening in this video, officer." Bryant stared at the screen, his face pale, sweat beading on his forehead. "I am effecting an arrest. You are physically assaulting a licensed paramedic and preventing her from rendering aid," Thorne corrected him. "Did you see the medical kit spill onto the ground? Did you see the patient, Chloe Davis, left unattended while you focused on handcuffing Ms. Jenkins?" By the end of the deposition, Cade Bryant was a changed man. His arrogance had evaporated, replaced by a sullen, defensive silence. His carefully constructed narrative of a hero cop had been exposed as a self-serving fantasy. He had walked into the room a confident officer of the law. He walked out a man who knew his career was over. The city's attorneys knew it too. Their faces were grim. Their star witness had just become their biggest liability. The day after the deposition felt like the eerie calm after a Category 5 hurricane has made landfall. The wreckage was still being assessed. The transcript of Cade Bryant's testimony read like a confession, a 4-hour masterclass in arrogance and evasion, all of it contradicted by the unimpeachable evidence of his own body camera. Ben Carter's phone rang late that afternoon. It was the lead counsel for the city of Oak Ridge. The tone on the other end of the line was no longer dismissive or condescending. It was the sound of utter and complete defeat. "They want to settle," Marcus told Sarah later that day in his office. He said it not with excitement, but with the grim satisfaction of a general who has just won a bloody but necessary battle. They know the deposition was an absolute disaster. They know what that body camera footage will do to a jury. Their own trial consultants probably told them they don't have a prayer of winning. They're no longer talking about nuisance value. He slid a single sheet of paper across the vast mahogany desk. On it was a number, typed in a simple black font. It felt heavier than the paper it was printed on. $5 million. Sarah stared at the figure. $5 million. It was an incredible, life-altering amount of money. It was more money than her father, a mechanic, had earned in his entire lifetime. It was an admission of guilt, a clear and unambiguous signal that the city knew it had no legal leg to stand on and was now desperately trying to stanch the bleeding. It was enough to pay off her mortgage, set up college funds for her 2 children, secure her retirement, and never have to worry about money again. It was everything the city had said her ordeal wasn't worth, and then some. Part of her, the tired, bruised part that had been living this nightmare for months, wanted to say yes. She wanted it to be over. She wanted to stop the endless meetings, the media attention, the gnawing anxiety of the impending trial. She wanted to go back to her life, to her ambulance, to the simple, profound, and anonymous work of saving people. She wanted to put Cade Bryant and the trauma he had inflicted in her rearview mirror forever. "What do you think?" she asked Marcus, her voice quiet, uncertain. Marcus leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers. His lawyerly mask was gone, replaced by the face of a trusted advisor. "From a purely financial perspective, Sarah, it's a very strong offer. We could probably push them a bit higher, maybe 6, but this is in the ballpark of a major victory without the risk and emotional toll of a trial. If you take this, you walk away with complete financial security. No one in the world would blame you for taking it and putting this hell behind you." He paused, his gaze steady and serious. "But you didn't come to me for a purely financial perspective. You came to me because you wanted justice." Justice. The word hung in the air between them. Was this justice? A check and a quiet end to the affair? Officer Bryant would almost certainly be fired as a condition of the settlement, but the system that created him, the policies that enabled him, the blue wall of silence that protected him, would remain unchanged. The next Cade Bryant in another city, on another sunny afternoon, could do the very same thing to another paramedic. The money would fix her problems, but it wouldn't fix the problem. She thought about Chloe Davis, trapped in her silent world, her life a constant reminder of the cost of those stolen minutes. She thought about the messages of support she'd received from EMTs and paramedics all across the country, stories of their own run-ins with police, of being bullied, threatened, and treated like subordinates instead of partners in the chaotic dance of emergency response. This wasn't just her fight anymore. It had become something much bigger. This $5 million offer, Sarah began, looking at Marcus, her mind working through the implications. It comes with a non-disclosure agreement, doesn't it? Marcus nodded slowly. Of course, an ironclad one. That's the main thing they're buying. They want your silence. They'll pay a premium for it. They want to make sure that body camera footage is never shown in a public courtroom. They want to ensure that Cade Bryant's deposition transcript is never released. They want this story to die right here, right now. That was the deal breaker. That was the poison pill hidden within the seductive, life-changing sum. They wanted to buy her story, to bury the truth she had fought so hard to bring to light. They wanted to pay her to pretend this never happened. They wanted to erase it from the public record, leaving the system that produced a disaster like Cade Bryant completely intact, ready to produce another. The exhaustion she had felt just moments before evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. The doubt vanished. No, she said. The single word was firm and clear, cutting through the quiet of the office. A slow smile spread across Marcus Thorne's face. It was the answer he had been hoping for, the one he knew in his gut she would give. No deal, Sarah repeated, leaning forward, her eyes flashing with a fire he hadn't seen before. This was never about the money, Marcus. You know that. This is about making sure that no paramedic, no EMT, no firefighter ever has to hesitate to treat a patient because they're afraid of the police officer standing over their shoulder. I want that body camera footage shown in court. I want Cade Bryant to have to answer for what he did in front of a jury of his peers. And I want a verdict that sends a message not just to the city of Oak Ridge, but to every police department in this country. You do not interfere with medical personnel who are saving a life. Period. Her stand was a declaration. She was turning down a fortune for a principle. She was choosing the uncertainty and agony of a public trial over the comfort and security of a private settlement. It was a choice that would require immense courage, a choice many people would call foolish. But for Sarah Jenkins, it was the only choice she could live with, the only one that would allow her to look at herself in the mirror, to continue wearing her uniform with honor. All right then, Marcus said, his smile widening. Let's go to war. The city's lawyers were stunned by her refusal. They had made a massive offer, one they were sure she would accept. Her rejection was a signal that this was no longer a negotiation. This was a crusade. With settlement talks officially dead, the machinery of the federal court system ground toward a trial date. The weeks leading up to it were a blur of intense preparation. Marcus and his team put Sarah through grueling mock cross-examinations, peppering her with the most aggressive, accusatory questions the city's lawyers could possibly devise. They wanted to prepare her for the stress of the witness stand, to ensure that her quiet, professional composure, the very quality that had been so powerful on the body cam footage, would hold firm under the relentless pressure of a courtroom. The trial was not just a legal proceeding anymore, it had become a referendum. It was a test of whether a single citizen, armed with the truth, could hold an entire system accountable. The city thought they could buy her off, that her integrity had a price tag. They were about to learn, in a very public and very expensive way, just how wrong they were. The trial began on a crisp autumn morning. The federal courtroom was packed with journalists, off-duty paramedics and firefighters in solidarity, and members of the public who had followed the case for months. Sarah sat at the plaintiff's table beside Marcus Thorne, her heart pounding a nervous rhythm against her ribs. Across the aisle, Cade Bryant sat with his legal team, looking smaller and paler without the protective shield of his uniform or the buffer of a deposition room. The jury selection process took 2 full days, a painstaking exercise in human psychology, as both sides sought 12 citizens who could be impartial. Marcus was looking for empathy, for people who could understand the concept of conflicting duties. The city's lawyers were looking for authoritarians, for people who believed a police officer's order was absolute. In the end, they seated a diverse group: a registered nurse, a retired military officer, a high school teacher, a software engineer, and 8 other ordinary citizens who would be the arbiters of justice. Marcus's first witness was not Sarah, but Chloe Davis's mother. In heartbreaking testimony, she described the vibrant, brilliant daughter she had lost and the silent, broken shell that remained. She spoke of a life of round-the-clock care, of feeding tubes and physical therapy, of a future stolen. The jury was visibly moved. Marcus had established the stakes. This wasn't about a wrongful arrest, it was about a life destroyed. Then, on the 4th day of the trial, came the main event. "Your Honor," Marcus said, his voice resonating through the silent courtroom, "the plaintiff would now like to play the body camera footage of former Officer Cade Bryant." The lights were dimmed. The large screen in front of the jury box flickered to life. For the next 10 minutes, the jury was transported to that sunny afternoon in Oak Ridge Park. They saw the scene not from a distance, but through the eyes of the man who created the crisis. They saw Sarah's focused professionalism. They saw Chloe's gray, dying face. They heard Bryant's aggressive demands and Sarah's calm, firm refusals. And then they saw it. They saw the camera lunge forward as Bryant grabbed Sarah. They saw him yank her away from her patient. They saw him spin her around and force her arms behind her back. The sharp, metallic clicks of the handcuffs echoed through the silent courtroom. Several jurors physically flinched. One woman, a grandmotherly figure, put her hand over her mouth in shock. A young man on the jury shook his head in disbelief. They weren't just hearing about the arrest anymore, they were witnessing an assault. When the video ended and the lights came up, the impact was visceral. It was no longer a matter of he said, she said. It was objective, undeniable reality. Sarah's testimony afterward was powerful in its simplicity and professionalism. She spoke not as a victim, but as an expert explaining a catastrophic failure in interagency cooperation. On cross-examination, the city's lawyer tried to paint her as insubordinate. "Ms. Jenkins, you'd agree that when a police officer gives you an order, you should follow it?" "I agree that I should follow a lawful order," Sarah corrected her gently. "An order that forces me to abandon a dying patient in violation of my medical oath and state law is not a lawful order." Cade Bryant's testimony was a disaster. He walked to the stand, a grim mask on his face. He knew what was coming. His claims of a chaotic scene and a belligerent paramedic sounded absurd after everyone had just watched the video. On cross-examination, Marcus approached him not with anger, but with surgical precision. "Mr. Bryant," he began, "we've all seen the footage from your body camera. We saw you arrest a paramedic while she was actively treating a woman whose airway was closing. I have only one question for you. Watching that video today, knowing that your delay caused Chloe Davis to suffer a permanent brain injury, is there anything you would have done differently?" It was a lifeline, a chance for him to show remorse, to show some sliver of humanity. He could have said, "In hindsight, I misjudged the situation." But his pride, the same fatal pride that had caused the entire disaster, would not let him. "No," Bryant said, his voice defiant. "I stand by my actions. I was following my training to secure the scene." Marcus let the answer hang in the air, a stunning admission of unrepentant arrogance. He walked back to the plaintiff's table. "No further questions, Your Honor." In that single defiant no, Cade Bryant had sealed his own fate. The closing arguments were a formality. The jury filed out. They were back in less than 3 hours. The foreman, the retired military officer, handed a slip of paper to the clerk. The clerk read the verdict in a clear voice that echoed in the silent room. On the claim of unlawful seizure in violation of the Fourth Amendment, we, the jury, find for the plaintiff, Sarah Jenkins. On the claim of false arrest, we find for the plaintiff. On the claim of battery, we find for the plaintiff. Sarah squeezed her eyes shut, tears streaming down her face. We will now read the damages, the clerk continued. For compensatory damages, including emotional distress and reputational harm, we award the plaintiff $900,000. A wave of murmurs went through the room, but the clerk wasn't finished. And for punitive damages, to be levied against Mr. Cade Bryant and the city of Oak Ridge for its willful and reckless disregard for the plaintiff's constitutional rights, we award the plaintiff $20 million. The courtroom erupted. $20.9 million. It was a thunderous, historic verdict, a number so large it was clearly meant not just to compensate, but to punish and to send a message. The jury hadn't just sided with Sarah, they had adopted her outrage. They had delivered the people's rebuke. The verdict was more than a legal victory, it was an earthquake. The $20.9 million judgment sent shockwaves through the city of Oak Ridge and beyond. It was a headline-grabbing figure that forced an immediate and painful reckoning within the city's leadership and police department. The message from the jury was unequivocal. The old way of doing business, of protecting bad cops and ignoring systemic problems, was no longer acceptable and would come at a devastating financial cost. The first domino to fall was Cade Bryant. Less than 24 hours after the verdict, following a rushed internal affairs investigation that suddenly found the courage to state the obvious, he was fired from the Oak Ridge Police Department. His career in law enforcement was over, his name forever linked to one of the largest civil rights verdicts in the state's history. But the changes didn't stop there. Facing immense public pressure and the looming even larger lawsuit from Chloe Davis's family, which the city quickly settled out of court for an undisclosed but reportedly massive sum, the city council approved a sweeping overhaul of police training and policy. The police chief, who had overseen a department that allowed a problem like Bryant to fester, was forced to resign. The city brought in outside consultants to rewrite the department's protocols for interacting with other first responders. The new policy, which became known informally as the Jenkins Mandate, was explicit. At a medical emergency scene, the senior paramedic, or EMT, was in command of patient care. Any interference by law enforcement, outside of a direct and articulable threat to life, was grounds for immediate suspension and investigation. The mandate was adopted by neighboring counties and became a model for departments across the country. The story of Sarah's ordeal and the staggering verdict became a case study in police academies and paramedic training programs nationwide. The body camera footage, once a piece of evidence, was now a powerful educational tool. It was used to teach new recruits on both sides of the emergency services divide about the critical importance of communication, de-escalation, and a clear understanding of roles at a chaotic scene. It showed in stark, undeniable detail how arrogance and a rigid adherence to a flawed concept of authority could escalate a situation with tragic consequences. For Sarah, the aftermath was a whirlwind. She was hailed as a hero, a champion for first responders. She was invited to speak at national EMS conferences and was instrumental in lobbying the state legislature. A year after her trial, the governor signed the First Responder Protection Act into law, a bill that codified many of the principles her case had brought to light, creating specific legal protections for medical personnel against obstruction or interference while performing their duties. Sarah stood beside the governor at the signing ceremony, a reluctant but powerful symbol of change. She eventually returned to work at Station 3. The money from the settlement afforded her complete financial freedom, but she couldn't imagine doing anything else. The ambulance, the adrenaline, the profound privilege of being the person someone called on the worst day of their life. It was woven into the very fiber of her being. Things were different, though. When she arrived at scenes, police officers treated her and her colleagues with a new level of respect, almost a reverence. They kept their distance. They offered help. They deferred to her medical judgment. Her battle had created a safer, more collaborative environment for everyone who wore her uniform. She had fought the war so they could do their jobs in peace. Her victory wasn't just in the courtroom. It was on the streets, every single day. In the quiet moments after the storm, reflection offers a clarity that chaos can never provide. Looking back, it becomes possible to trace the intricate web of choices and circumstances that led to that violent confrontation in the park. What drove Officer Cade Bryant? It wasn't simple malice, but something more insidious. A deep-seated insecurity masked by a rigid, aggressive interpretation of authority. Perhaps he came from a world where strength was equated with control, and any challenge, especially from a calm, competent black woman in a position of expertise, was perceived not as a difference of professional opinion, but as a direct threat to his identity. He had been trained to see the world as a series of threats to be neutralized, and in his mind, Sarah's refusal to comply made her just another threat. If Bryant had been able to pause, to listen, to see the dying woman on the grass as a person instead of a prop in his own power play, the entire tragedy could have been averted. And what of Sarah? If she had been less confident, less forged by the pressures of her 2 decades of service, would she have backed down? If she hadn't possessed that core of steel, perhaps she would have made the easier choice to show her ID, gambling with a stranger's life to avoid a confrontation. The victory was born not just from the injustice of the moment, but from a lifetime of preparation that had unknowingly armed her for that specific fight. Her refusal was not an act of spontaneous defiance, but the logical conclusion of a career spent prioritizing life above all else. This story is a testament to the fact that one person's unwavering commitment to their duty can expose and correct a systemic flaw. It reminds us that true courage isn't about being confrontational. It's about holding fast to one's principles when it is most difficult, when the personal cost is highest. What do you think is the most important lesson from Sarah's story? Have you ever witnessed a situation where someone had to choose between doing what was easy and doing what was right? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and please support our channel so we can continue to bring you these important stories.